participants. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the keynote speaker at this webinar this evening. Professor Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned distinguished professor of economics at Columbia University, United States of America. He is a former director of the Earth Institute and current director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the same Columbia University. Professor Sachs has worked extensively in the areas of sustainable development and environment. For many years, he served as special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General. He has also served as advisor to presidents in several countries, including Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. He is a recipient of many awards, including national honors of some countries. I have the pleasure, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to invite Professor Sachs to present the keynote address. Thank you.
Very sorry to be late. I was just in the holding area. Now you've promoted me to the panel, so I can see everybody.
Yes, now we can see you. Please go ahead, Professor Sachs. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to meet together and open, I hope, some long-term strategic contacts on this important topic of Africa and its future in the coming decades. Everybody knows we're in a period of tremendous disruption and flux right now. Donald Trump is just a part of that, but he's definitely a part of that. We're in a period of massive geopolitical change. The rise of China is certainly the most significant geopolitical reality of our age, but it's not only the rise of China. Many parts of the world are experiencing a massive advance in technology, in their geopolitical weight. India is another example. Russia obviously is a great power in the world today, and I count on Africa being the same way in the coming years, as I'll speak about. But geopolitics is changing rapidly. Of course, the technological revolution is changing our economies dramatically, faster than we can keep up. The advances in artificial intelligence are very real. The advances in robotics are very real. The advances in space-based technologies, surveillance, and ability for satellite imagery change many ways that governments function, certainly, unfortunately, ways that armies function. But these technologies are deep and are changing rapidly. At the same time, we have the environmental crises that actually have accelerated dramatically just in recent years. The Earth has warmed just in the last 4 years by 0.3 degrees Celsius. This is absolutely remarkable. In the past, that might have taken 20 years to happen. But in just 4 years, we had warming of 0.3 degrees Celsius, so we actually exceeded the 1.5 degree centigrade limit that was agreed in Paris in 2015 as the upper limit that we would do everything to avoid. And we have massive demographic change underway as well. In some parts of the world, populations have peaked and are beginning to decline. China is a case in point. China's population has peaked at 1.4 billion, but if current assessments of future fertility are borne out, China's population will be under 1 billion by the end of this century, even around 700 million, according to the United Nations forecast. At the same time, Africa's population continues to soar. It's at about 1.5 billion today. By mid-century, perhaps 2.5 billion. And according to the UN estimates, it could be as much as 3.5 billion by the end of the century, roughly 35 to 40% of the world population. So we are in the midst of massive change. I think from Africa's point of view, of course, the main question is how should Africa as a unity, Africa as the African Union, be positioned for success in the coming years? How should Africa as a union move forward rapidly, economically, technologically, and in terms of the quality of infrastructure? How should Africa as a unit face the challenges of the climate change, the threats to biodiversity, the loss of the Congo Basin rainforests to deforestation, and many other environmental challenges as well? And how should Africa participate in a very tough geopolitical world that is now multipolar, where great powers, the major powers, the United States, Russia, China, India, are in quite intense and I would say dangerous competition as well, and where those major powers have their eyes on Africa's natural resources. I started the day in a Zoom meeting in India, and the main topic of that session was strategic minerals. Well, all of the talk was about how the major powers would secure their strategic mineral supply chains. But frankly, they were talking about you. And it was mainly about competition between Russia, India, China, the United States. Africa was not in that particular discussion, but it was the object of the discussion in part. Ukraine, too, is being basically pulled to pieces right now, in part, not only, but in part, because of competition for the strategic minerals in Ukraine. So what do I envision in all of this? What would I, broadly speaking, recommend for the 1.5 billion people of Africa and what will soon be 2, 3, and more billion people in Africa? First, quite obviously, I believe that the next 40 years can be and absolutely needs to be a period of extremely rapid economic growth. And I would like Africa to follow the path that China and India have been on. China, during the period from 1980 to 2020, achieved around 10% per year economic growth. And that meant a more than 30-time increase of the size of the Chinese economy. India today is growing at around 6% per year. I think it will increase to around 7% per year. And that is also a rapid rate that is transforming India's economy, ending its extreme poverty, and putting India also into advanced technologies. As for Africa, I believe that Africa can and should aim for and can achieve economic growth of on the order of 8 to 10% per year for the 4 decades up to, let me say, 2063, the 100th anniversary of African unity. So I would like Africa both to model and to implement a very high growth strategy in the coming 40 years. And I think that the roadmap that China achieved and that India is achieving is very helpful for Africa as well. Africa currently is growing at 3 or 4% per year aggregate, and because of rapid population growth, around 2 or 2.5%. That's not good enough in per capita terms. That is of course, absolutely unsafe and insufficient for Africa. So the growth rate needs to be increased markedly. And the questions are how to do that. Now, the first point is that high growth results from high investment rates. And those investments are of multiple kinds. They are most importantly investments in education and the skills of young people. And here, Africa, of course, is the youngest continent in the world. So almost half of the population is at school age, not quite, but nearly. And those young people need a quality education, and there's no time to miss for them. And when they drop out in lower secondary or before finishing upper secondary, this is a cost for a whole lifetime and a cost for the society. So the first order of business in achieving the next 40 years of rapid growth is achieving a very high level of educational attainment. And that is expensive, and it takes a long time to realize the returns, 20 years to educate a child, but the returns are the highest returns a society can achieve. In fact, around 20% internal rate of return to educate a child through upper secondary education. The second kind of investment is investment in infrastructure, transport, power grid, digital, water and sanitation, and climate resilience, all of these main categories of infrastructure. The third kind of investment is in technology and innovation. And I mention this because this isn't just a byproduct of the market forces. Governments need to invest in research and development to get the benefits of technological advance. Yes, some technologies come from abroad, but much has to be adapted locally and reconditioned locally, and that requires domestic R&D. And Africa spends a small fraction of 1% of GDP on research and development, whereas China and the US around 3% of GDP, Korea around 4.5% of GDP. And so Africa's innovation economy needs investment by the state across Africa. And the fourth area, of course, is business investment. But business investment comes especially when there are skilled workers and quality infrastructure and the ability to adopt or adapt advanced technologies. Then the businesses will come in beyond the traditional investments in the mining sector or perhaps in some agriculture. They will come in on a large scale, including in the industrial economy. Now, my view is that Africa can accomplish a high rate of investment of at least 40% of GDP per year, just like China has done, but it requires a strategy. And the strategy needs to be at the union level, in my view. So a continental free trade area is an extremely important part of that. But as we all know, it's only at the beginning. There are still massive barriers to trade within Africa, barriers that are regulatory, barriers that are border crossing barriers, barriers that are infrastructure barriers because the rail simply isn't there, or the trucking system isn't there, or the fiber and the power isn't there. But all of this, I think, is critical because Africa will not achieve rapid growth one country at a time, but it can achieve rapid growth by being the third part of the world, in addition to China and India, that has a population of 1.5 billion, a huge internal market, and with the right investments, the prospect of the fastest economic growth in the entire world. So that, for me, is the aim, is the agenda. Of course, it means making the African Union much more effective than it has been in the past. It is in the past been, of course, a place for many areas of agreement and progress, but it has not played the central role in the Africa-wide economy that it needs to play. And the projects of NEPAD that are the trans-border projects now need to be implemented. And the implementation needs to be in line with the continental free trade area, which has been established. This also means, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this and turn it back over to you, a financing strategy to achieve this rapid rate of growth based on high investment rates. My own view is that Africa's debt is not too high, it's too low. Africa should be borrowing a lot more on international capital markets, but not the kind of borrowing it's been doing. When it borrows, Africa has been borrowing at 5 years or 7 years. But the development that I'm talking about is 25 or 30-year horizons. And what happens is countries borrow 7-year Euro bonds, and then when those come due, they can't repay. And then they enter into a financial spiral, an IMF program, and it's the end. It's the end of growth. It's the end of the investment agenda. The IMF says, don't you dare try to have those high investment rates again. That's too destabilizing, and things come crashing down. But my view is the mistake is the short-term maturity of these debts, because development is a high return activity, but over a 30-year period, not over a 7-year period. If you borrow to put a child in school, 7 years can get you from first grade to 8th grade, but it can't get you the returns to repay the loan. And so, in my view, the biggest problem that Africa has faced is finance. The biggest challenge is long-term, low-cost financing. My view is that if the markets behave properly, this would come automatically because Africa has the highest growth potential of any region of the whole world. Starting poorer, accumulating capital, Africa can grow at these astoundingly high rates. And so it's not risky to lend to Africa, but it is risky to lend for 7 years. The lending should be 25, 30, or 40 years. And this requires a financial strategy for Africa. One basic part of the strategy, by the way, should be to increase the scale of the African Development Bank. The African Development Bank borrows on the international markets and then on-lends to the member states of the African Union on good terms. But the scale of the African Development Bank is tiny. It's only about $5 billion of lending per year. It should be $50 to $100 billion of lending per year. There'll be, I think, the opportunity for a major scale-up of the capital of the African Development Bank in the coming year. Don't wait for the United States and Europe. Do it yourself. The US and Europe are not going to scale up the African Development Bank. The United States isn't going to put $1 into African development. It may try to steal some minerals, but it's not going to put $1 into African development. You're going to have to do this in Africa and with countries that are really committed to long-term development. You have partners in the Gulf region. You have partners in the government of India. You have partners in the government of China. That's where Africa's long-term financing is going to come, not from the United States, alas, and not from Europe. So financing is key. The African Development Bank is not the only multilateral bank of Africa. There are many multilateral development banks. They should all be scaled up significantly. And maybe some new ones invented, a West African Development Bank, an East African Development Bank, a Southern African Development Bank, because the lesson is that these multilateral banks borrow on better terms than their owners. I like the example in Latin America of what's called the Andean Development Fund, or the CAF. Its owners are all below investment grade, but they got together, pooled their capital, developed the Andean Development Fund, and that fund, on behalf of their members, borrows at creditworthy rates and on-lends to the owners who are not creditworthy according to the traditional credit ratings. So actually, there's leverage by unity. There's leverage by multilateralism. And don't let the US or France or the EU or the IMF or anybody else talk you out of getting the funding you need for the long-term, large-scale investments. I had the pleasure to work with the African Development Bank on a study that was just released on rapid growth for Africa to 2063, led by the chief economist, the excellent chief economist of the African Development Bank, Kevin Urama. And that report is an analytical basis, in my view, for how the African Union can move forward on this high growth agenda. Nigeria obviously has a leadership role to play in this. As the largest economy, the most populous nation in Africa, with so many leaders in finance and in business. So I really want you to take the lead, but not only for Nigeria's development, but for Africa-wide, because if Africa succeeds as a continental scale economy, Nigeria will boom, and it will boom as part of this overall continental scale success. So in the meantime, it's going to be a noisy environment. Donald Trump will pull out of the Paris Agreement. Yesterday, the United States vetoed a very standard UN General Assembly resolution because the US said it endorsed this, that the resolution endorsed the Sustainable Development Goals, which the US government said is not in the interest of the United States. It's unbelievable. We're in a nasty period of time. Okay, the United States says that's our self-interest. They don't know what their self-interest is. But don't be perturbed. Don't be put off. This is Africa's time. And look at what China accomplished. Look at what India accomplished. Act as a unity. 55 countries. That's the legacy of European imperialism, that there are 55. But think like one and act like one. And believe me, Africa's success in the next 40 years will be the biggest success on the whole planet. So thank you for letting me share these brief remarks with you. I hope that something resonated with that. And if so, I would look forward to continuing to brainstorm with you on such ideas. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sachs. That indeed resonated, I'm quite sure, with all of us. The challenges you placed before us as Africans as to what we need to do. Very, very important proposals here, Professor Sachs. I hope you can stay with us for a little while.
I can stay with a little while, yes, for about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, for only 15 minutes. I then think that what we should do, colleagues, is that we had a couple of other speakers, Professor Sachs, but I think I will hold them so that we can then respond to what you have said. So that we can then release you in 15 minutes after engaging you. So colleagues, you've got that. I'm looking for the electronic hands.
I see Kingsley.
Is the electronic hand there?
Chairman, should I go forward?
Yeah, please go ahead, yeah.
Yes. Jeff, thanks very much for those remarks. I just wanted to know what you think about something you broached earlier in your speech, and that is this question of population growth, which outpaces economic growth in most African countries. Is Africa condemned to poverty by its child-rearing propensities? Or should we manage our population growth the way China managed its population growth in order to prosper? This is a very important question because in many of our countries, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
Kingsley, thank you. Let me tell you a little bit of a joke, but true. Once I said in Nigeria that maybe Nigeria should consider a 3-child policy. China had a 1-child policy, and maybe Nigeria should have a 3-child policy. And I was almost run out of the room. It was not even taken as a, it wasn't even taken as a humorous point. But let me make a basic point that is a fact. You know, you're trying to keep up with an extraordinarily rapidly growing population. And the fertility rate Africa-wide right now is 4. That's down from what it was 25 years ago. But when the fertility rate is 4, it means that every mother is having 2 daughters on average. And since the interval, the mean age for childbearing is about 28 years for the mother, it means that the doubling is roughly every 28 years when the fertility rate is 4. So Africa's on a very rapid growth path of population. When you're on such a rapid growth path, so much of saving is just to keep ahead of the population because you need more schools for the children, you need more roads for the rising population, you need more houses. So it's what we call capital widening rather than capital deepening. Capital deepening means that the capital per person rises, which is what produces higher output per person. Whereas capital widening means, oh my God, the population's doubling every 28 years. We just have to use all our saving just in this breathless race to keep up. Now, I think that the African fertility rate will change voluntarily in the coming years if 2 things happen. 1, keep the kids in school. This is so important. It's probably the most important determinant of fertility choice. When girls get a high school degree or higher, they have fewer children. Why? Well, first, their labor market opportunities are much higher. Second, there is a delay in marriage, in age of marriage, and in the onset of fertility. So there's a huge demographic transition that occurs with education. And you mentioned a phrase, Kingsley, you said the propensities of fertility. I don't believe, I mean, there are, of course, cultural propensities, but every culture in the world was a high fertility culture at one point, every one. You look back 100 years, everyone had high fertility rates in the United States, in China. China had more than 7 children per woman at one point. But it's not some fundamental part of culture. It is the life experience of people in a particular context. As education rises, fertility rates come down. Not if the girls drop out of school, however. And second, the other huge determinant of reduced fertility is urbanization. And Africa is rapidly urbanizing as well. So if Africa, and one reason, by the way, why Africa will urbanize faster than people think is that agriculture will be mechanized in Africa much faster than people think, because robots really are going to do the agricultural work. They're going to be able to do it next year. In the coming years, we're going to have dozens of humanoid robots coming out of China that are going to be able to do agricultural work at lower cost, even than very, very low cost agricultural workers. The jobs are not going to be in agriculture, except at actually more intellectual jobs, in fact. And so this is going to mean people are going to be looking for jobs in urban contexts. Cities are going to grow a lot faster. In fact, Africa is going to urbanize dramatically in the next 30 years. That's going to be a big challenge. That's housing, sewerage, water, power. But in general, providing infrastructure is much easier in a densely settled urban environment than it is in rural areas. So it's going to mean an improvement in the infrastructure. So all of this means, just to finish, it just means the fertility rates will change quickly. But I would say the most important thing that governments can do right now is keep the kids in school well educated. And for that, they need extra financing because education is not cheap. But of course, it also needs to use modern tools like online, like digital access, and so forth. My proposition is government should actually borrow for education, but on 40-year loans, because those kids are going to provide a growth of the economy in 40 years that's going to be unrecognizable. Don't let them languish out of school today because the money's not there. That's the IMF advice, unfortunately. The right advice is borrow what you need, get the kids through skill levels, make them pay a payroll tax later on from their higher earnings to repay those loans, and finance all of this at a 40-year basis, 40-year tenor.
Thanks. Professor Sachs, we've got, of the 15 minutes that you gave us, we have used 7.
Okay, I'll be shorter in my answers.
Yeah, I've got at least 3 hands here. Oluse Makinde, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Sachs. I run a subnational in Nigeria, and my question is really very short. You want everybody to come together. You mooted the idea of West African Development Bank, East African Development Bank. But Africa has 1.4, 1.5 billion people, but we're 54 countries. Yep. With everybody trying to protect their own turf. Even in Nigeria, for instance, we have 36 states. 36 states, for everybody to work together, it's also a big problem. So what will be your suggested path? You know, remember this came from Berlin when in
1885.
1885, they partitioned the entire continent. So I'd like to have your perspective towards this. Thank you so much.
Let me give you one quick answer. You know, in the United States, when the British colonies rebelled and won their independence, actually thanks to France, who fought the British, in 1781, suddenly there were 13 independent nations, and they regarded themselves as independent. Carolina, Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New York, they thought were a country. And they tried for 7 years to act as 13 independent countries under a confederacy that they called the Articles of Confederation. It was a disaster. And then a very clever politician came along named James Madison and said, we're all going to go to hell unless we're able to get a real federal government. And he brought everyone to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They worked for a few months. They had to convince all these 13 independent nations they're going to be better off. And they pulled it off. It was a little bit of a miracle. They pulled it off and made one country. So Africa has to do something like this. It has to strengthen the African Union. I don't say it's easy. Even the European Union, sometimes is dysfunctional. It's 27, you're 55, and it's hard. But what I would like to see the new commission in Addis do, and it's coming into office actually next week, I want them to lay out a vision for Africa, a rapid growth vision, a success story. Here's what we can do if we work together. And then get key presidents from around Africa to say, okay, we're better off together than if we oppose this, and use the vision thing to push a much more structured approach. Because if you have a bold goal, then people can coalesce around the bold goal. But I don't want to oversimplify. This is hard political work to pull this off.
Thanks, thanks, Prof. Brian Kagoro.
Thanks, Professor Sachs. Just two quick ones. I see that south of the G7, original G7 countries, almost 60% have declining fertility rates. And of the emerging powers, the ones that we've often deified, South Korea is almost getting into negative population growth rates.
Yeah.
And that Europe, in this moment, had a 300 to 700,000 gap in its employment. And what it was doing is coming to Africa to get the workers, which workers had been educated using some aid money that had been for a higher education. Number one, is there a case generally for that particular one to have a better terms of arrangement where it's not the UK government dealing with individual citizens, but dealing with the countries from, and that's for Europe. And then you have a second one. I would like to know what's your position as the theme of the year for the African Union is justice for Africans and Afro-descendants through reparations. What is your position when you think about part of ways and means in which to offset debt and deal with growth forward? What is the place of reparations?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. Oh, time is so short, and I'd we'll find ways to continue a long discussion. When it comes to the brain drain and taking African doctors, nurses, engineers that have been trained and paid for in Africa by the state, and then taking them to the Gulf or to Britain or to France and so forth, we need a tax arrangement that says no way that their taxes are going to Britain or France or to Saudi or elsewhere. Those taxes are coming back first to Africa. We paid for the education. And this needs to be a policy negotiation. I think it's actually feasible. Africa cannot educate its people at government expense on debt, have them go abroad, and then have those debts go into default. So this is a part of the financing strategy that needs to be that needs to be worked out. Sorry, and then on reparations. Oh, look, the world owes Africa a lot, and it's going to be very hard to collect. By the way, especially my government is so nasty. It's it's trying to still grab everything from everybody else. And Donald Trump loves, he calls it liquid gold. Any place with oil, oops, that's you. That's Canada. That's Greenland. He wants, like a child, he wants to grab. And so getting reparations out of this is morally right, logically right, practically difficult. I think Africa's biggest revenge, if I could put it that way, or response is to be a great economic success in the next 40 years. And Africa will have more than a third of the world population. And if Africa reaches a high income status and more than a third of the world population, you're going to be at the center of the world economy by 2060. That is what I would aim for. It's actually achievable. It's really achievable. It depends fundamentally on education, skills, and investment in technology and infrastructure. But do it.
Thanks, Prof. One last hand. Professor Kolade.
Thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency, and thank you, Professor Sachs, for your intervention. My question relates to the point you made about technology and how this will, accelerate, structural transformation of the African economy, especially the mechanization of agriculture, which is a really important point. But it also throws up, a significant problem because technology is also a double-edged sword, right? So it's a force both of inclusion and exclusion. And there are problems already of technological unemployment, even in developed countries. So because what happens if robots do all the work? What happens to the smallholder, for example? But also in other labor-intensive, economic activities. So what are your thoughts about how technology, the problem that is inherent, what are your thoughts about what the continent can do and what individual countries can do to forestall, to anticipate, and to mitigate this problem of technological unemployment?
Perfect question. Technology really is a double-edged sword, and not just in theory. We see it in the United States. We became two societies, those with a college degree and those with a high school degree or less. College, you're doing great. The pie's bigger. Everything's fine. High school, you can't find a job, or you're gig work and living in poverty. So this is very real, and it's a very real issue. The pie gets bigger, but it gets divided more unevenly. And there are two basic points to what to do about that uneven pie. One is to ensure that everybody has better skills, because truly the lower skilled work will go away, like it or not. And so the skilling is really more important than ever. The second is fiscal policy should ensure that everybody can get health care, everybody can get an education, everybody has access to infrastructure. In the United States, we don't have that. This is, the US is a very nasty society. We don't have guaranteed health insurance. Other rich countries do, the United States not. And so this is also a matter of internal redistribution. So skilling and redistributive, or what are sometimes called predistributive policies, investing in children, investing in nutrition, making sure that everybody benefits so that you don't get the downside of this. Now, I would say on the whole, these technologies are coming like it or not. So getting ready for them is critical. And that means an upgrading of education. It means an upgrading of the curriculum. It means connecting African high school students with enterprises for particular apprenticeships and skilling. It also, to my mind, means a strong partnership of Africa and China. And the reason I say that is China's just been through 4 decades of rapid growth and rapid technological upgrading. They're really good at this. Chinese companies are in the cutting edge of a lot of the key technologies, like electric vehicles, like battery supply chains, like renewable energy. Get them to invest in production in Africa so that Africa is not just importing the final goods, but is producing them. But leapfrog by bringing in the high-tech Chinese companies as partners, because they will come. The American companies won't. They're in a different world. The Chinese companies understand very much the circumstances that Africa faces, how to produce high efficiency, and it will bring a lot of technology. So I'm a big believer in China-Africa cooperation. Of course, there are other regions that Africa should cooperate with. The Gulf region is also making big investments. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, promised Trump $600 billion of investment in the United States. And all I could think was, what are you doing investing in the US at 2% growth? You should be investing in Africa at 8% growth right across the Red Sea. So we've got to convince some of the investors that Africa is the fast-growing place and that they're going to be skilled workers. But the point you're making is absolutely real. And the way to keep ahead of it is to keep ahead of the skill curve.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sachs. We've exceeded the 15 minutes you gave us by 1 minute. So
it was my pleasure.
I think we've done very well. But Professor Sachs, let me say thanks a lot indeed on behalf of the Awolowo Foundation for participating in this webinar with us. We are recording the proceedings, so what was in addition to our notes, we'll be able to get the transcript of what you've said, because I think the observations you've made about what Africa should do are critically important. I'd also say we'll also have a look at the report that you've done with the African Development Bank. But Professor, thanks a lot. You are excused.
Thank you to everybody, and let's stay in touch because this is a very exciting time, and I want to work together with you on it.